All right, let's open in a word of prayer. Brother Dave, would you like to open us in prayer?
Father, we're thankful that we can gather tonight. Thank you for bringing us here safely. Pray that you would speak through Don and that we would understand and learn everything that he's about to present. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, we're coming into some fascinating books. There's two in a row we're going to see that are they're very unusual in a lot of respects. And the first one we're going to see, and we're in our series now as we're moving right along, is we are dealing with the book of Ecclesiastes, first one up. Now, in all the books of the Bible that you're going to run across, you will not find one so negative in tone as this one is. This book is so hopeless in so many respects. And I think you can see that Solomon wrote this later in life, and by his own admission, you'll notice in our notes, we said that Solomon wrote this as a bitter old man by his own admission. Ecclesiastes 4:13, better is a poor and wise child than an old and foolish king who will no more be admonished. And you'll notice what we put in here. Much of Solomon's troubles came from heeding some of his foreign, non-Jewish, his foreign wives who led him into idolatry. Now, when Solomon married some of these people, and you can go back and see some in 1 Kings 11, we have verses 1 through 8. Solomon married women that worshiped some of the gods, like the gods of the Moabites, Chemosh, and some of the different gods. And he even ultimately built temples for them to worship God. And it even says at one point he went and I believe he worshipped Chemosh, which is one of the pagan deities. And so you can see what happened to this man. Now, he set out in life for something different. He set out to learn. He wanted to, in the first chapter, it says, you can see in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, he had an interesting beginning. He was a wise man, and he knew a lot. And for him to come to this point, he saw God at least 2 times face to face. The second person of deity took on flesh. It would have been a theophany or a weophany, if you'd like to call it that. And twice he was told what to do, and he was very plain and very easy to understand. He was to walk like his father David did in integrity towards the law. Now, in verses 12 and 13, you find out where Solomon got started on this course, and this course kind of led him down the road to disaster. One of the things in the Old Testament where you see the major difference is that the world system in the Old Testament was not a spiritual enemy. That might strike you as being unusual. The world system was not regarded as a spirit. In fact, it was regarded as a friend, because if you were obedient to the law, you had material benefits. So the law didn't make the world system an enemy. So this is kind of an unusual thing. And so, Pastor, there's another point for us along the way. It's a small point, and compared to the stuff that Pastor's just blowing the law out the window and blowing the Old Testament away. And if anybody is really halfway honest at all, how could they ever see the Old Testament being the same as the New Testament? How could they take the Gospels? How could they take anything and make it for our practice? You just have to be deliberately a heretic, somebody that just was determined to do that, like a cultist. But if you look at verses 12 and 13 of the first chapter, here's where Solomon had his start. He said, I, the preacher, was king over Israel, and I gave my heart to seek out and search out by wisdom all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. And he continues on. We could go on further. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, it is all vanity and vexation of spirit. So he starts off trying to see and understand everything that's done under heaven, of all the works and difficulties of man. What does he come up with? He comes up with an understanding of the enormous amount of unrighteousness and inequity that goes on in everyday life. It always has. It goes on today. It's going to go on right up until the rapture. It'll go on through the tribulation. It'll go on up until the kingdom. All these little inequities in life, it always goes on. So he saw all of this, and he could not do one thing about it. And so he basically drove himself half crazy, plus listening to the advice of his foreign wives. And so, really, I think if you're going to take anything out of this book, a simple principle would be this. Any believer in any dispensation who ignores deliberately, willfully, what God has told him to do is his rules of conduct, is going to wind up in extreme misery. That's what happened to this man. If you're going to take a lesson away, this is an illustration of what kind of misery that you can have from simply being disobedient to what God has for us today. You want to be carnal? This is probably, now I wouldn't call him carnal because you weren't spiritual in the Old Testament, but this would be the closest thing to having carnality in the Old Testament. This is what this man did. He was miserable. And he does, however, which is surprising, he does have some good advice. Along with his admission of who he is in the 4th chapter, as he is an old and foolish king, he does have 2 points, and you'll notice we put them in our notes. Solomon does end the book with words that are wise. He warns young men, "Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. But know thou that for all these things God will bring you into judgment." So that's not bad advice, considering how much he messed his life up. And I wonder what he would have done if he'd have known what Rehoboam was going to do. Oh boy, that's even worse. Then his last thing he said is probably the best words in the book, and the only thing I would say that really, really, really is a good, solid thing to follow. Verses 12 and 13, Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." Why? For, or because, Old Testament equivalent, because God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So there you have it. That was his conclusion. So if you're taking anything away from Ecclesiastes as you go through it, you can see by our outline, he looks at he has Proverbs that he states about the inequities of life in the 5th to the 10th chapter, the vanity of all aspects of life in the first 4 chapters, and the conclusion, the final application. And there's really not much in there. I know when we read through the Bible, we follow it along in the morning. And when we come to Ecclesiastes, my wife will typically say after we finish this chapter, "I can't take any more of this happiness. Let's go to the New Testament." And we kind of, we have a lot of fun with it sometimes. And when you get to some of these things, you say, how could somebody be so miserable? He was rich. Well, he found out. Now, we come on, and we're going to go on to the next book, and we don't have much to say about Ecclesiastes, and really, if you take away that one principle, this shows you any believer in any dispensation that's obedient to the rules of conduct God has given for daily life is going to be utterly miserable. That's the one thing it'll teach you. That's about it. Now, the Song of Solomon. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Here's a book that is just terribly mutilated. When taken literally, this is simply an Old Testament celebration of married love. Now, I'm reading the first paragraph under point Q, the Song of Solomon, a story of wedded love. Although some have heavily allegorized the Song of Solomon to make it a picture of Christ's love for the church, there is no biblical basis for this. There are no indicators in the book itself, nor is there any New Testament revelation to support an allegorical interpretation. I have a simple thing to say to people who want to try and allegorize this to show Christ's love for the church. Why don't you go to the New Testament where it says so? It says in Ephesians that he loved the church and he gave himself for it. Isn't that good enough? If I got to go back here and try and twist this and make it say what I want it to say, people are just so determined. That there's a cliche that you might have heard, that Christ is preached everywhere in the Bible, and every verse, every place you should see, so you've got to find Christ here. And that kind of thinking has led people to find, well, what are you going to do? You're going to have to twist this something terrible to do it. Now you'll notice, by the end of his life, Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, that is a real problem. That is a very big, we know that from 1 Kings 11:3, not from the book of Solomon, or Song of Solomon itself. But there's a big problem here. You'll notice I put in your notes Deuteronomy 17:17. Now the law of Moses made provision for a king. It did not recommend a king. It did not say they had to have a king, but it was put in there because the time would come, and it says back in Deuteronomy, when the people were going to want a king. And that happened when Samuel was there. Samuel's 2 sons, who he tried to make judges after him, were crooked. They were not like their dad. And so the people demanded a king. You can find that back in 1 Samuel. So, So, what the provision for a king was made, and one of the things it was not supposed to do is the king was not, and you can find this in Deuteronomy 17:17, was not supposed to multiply wives. Now, it's interesting to note, they could have more than one wife. And you look at a lot of these righteous kings back here, David had, what was it, I think 8 wives or something like that? He had a whole string of them. I mean, he seemed like every time he found a good-looking lady, he married her. You know, it was just I can see where Solomon got his start from. He looked at Daddy and he says, "Daddy can do that much. What's what I can do?" So he went crazy with it. So, and the reason was back, and you find in Deuteronomy 17:17, that his heart turned not away. Because if you found a king like Solomon that started marrying these beautiful women from Moab, from Syria, from all of those countries around about, none of them worshiped Jehovah God. And if they came in and brought their gods in with them, it's that same old story. I heard it before. How many times, Pastor, have you known somebody that married an unbeliever and said they were going to win him to Christ? Have you ever seen it ever happen? From those that say, I've seen it. I've heard them say it. I've heard them claim it. I've never seen it happen. Now, I think it has happened. I think one person one time in Bible college was telling a story. It was a big story because it actually was a case where an unsaved person was brought to Christ by marrying a saved person. Does that make it right, though? Well, that saved person was still wrong to do that, But it does. But more often, so Solomon, he walked into a position where it was going to make him just miserable. Now, You'll notice down in the third paragraph down, when Solomon married the Shulamite, he already had 60 wives and 80 concubines. Now that comes out of Song of Solomon 6 verse 8. And his wife, the Shulamite, said that there are already 60 queens and 80 concubines. So she's number 61. I don't know. I kind of wonder, gals, would you like to be the 61st wife? But so I think that puts it a little bit earlier in Solomon's reign, although it's not at the beginning. To have 60 wives, he was there for 40 years on the throne, so this is maybe 15, I'm going to guesstimate around 12 to 15 years into his reign that he met this girl. So he would have been still probably in his 30s, maybe early 40s, but probably in his 30s when he met this girl. So he was still ready to go. Now, but you'll notice, now there's something I think is important here, and I want you to see this because this will tell you something why this book is important. I believe there are 2 indicators that this was the true love of Solomon's life. Now, there's no way you're going to tell me that Solomon was in love with 700 different women. Come on. Guys, be honest with me. Have you looked at other women and saw any that you'd even find close to your wife? Could you love another woman? You can't love more than one woman. 700? Come on. Did he love any of them? He loved one. And this was the one. And I think what you see is this book was the true love of his Solomon's life. He should have married only one woman, and this was her. This was it. Now, why would I say that? Well, notice what I put in the notes. Well, this book is dedicated to Solomon's love for the Shulamite. Now, considering that Solomon wrote nothing in Scripture about his other wives, this one must have been really special. This is the one that got the song. This was dedicated. This book is dedicated to her. So that puts her way up on top. And secondly, the title in the Song of Solomon is the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, which means this was Solomon's favorite or his best song. So these 2 factors make me believe that to my way of thinking, there's no question, this was the woman he should have married. If there was going to be just one woman for him, this was her. This was the one he should have married. What about the other ones? Well, his first wife was the daughter of Pharaoh. It was a military type alliance, which was not that unusual, and it was probably more of a show marriage because if you read through Kings, you'll find out that she kind of stayed off to the side. He built her a palace to live in, but it wasn't his palace. So it's like, what's going on here? She's a show wife. He has to. I don't know how many children he had by her, but she didn't have anything because with Bathsheba, or rather, it was his other wives that he got. Solomon and let's see, which wife? Anyhow, Rehoboam came from. I forget which one of his wives, but it wasn't the daughter of Pharaoh. I can't remember now. I'm almost went back to David. But so he had trophy wives. Some of these were trophy wives, and military alliance type things, which it seems kind of strange. But the Pharaoh, the Egyptians were not going to attack Israel because it's Pharaoh's daughter's up there, and we can't do this. Now, one of the unique features about this book that will help you understand it is you'll notice the last paragraph. One of the unique features is that the Song of Solomon has a chorus that's identified as the daughters of Jerusalem, and I give you some references, and the daughters of Zion. Now, what these were ladies that were connected to the court. There might have even been some other queens or concubines, possibly, that were involved with court that she was talking to. So you'll see that it goes back and forth, and if you don't catch the fact that it's a case where she's talking while she is in a capital city, and she's talking from her room to these people while they're fixing her hair or doing whatever, but she's talking to women that were in attendance to her. And so so that helps you to understand, because you'll see different times when it says, oh, this and that, and it's like someone is talking to her in the third person feminine, and it is. It's this group right here. So it kind of makes it a little easier to understand. But I think what we can take away from this book is just one simple thing. This just shows you in the Old Testament what ideal married love was. This was what real love was like. You see the passion that is there. You see you read through some of this stuff, and it's almost embarrassing, the things that are said. And I'm told that when the Jewish young people try to read the Hebrew, they don't let them have the Song of Solomon. They won't give it to them, because it honestly comes very close to being at least R-rated, if not X. And so they don't want them to get into it too much. But the Song of Solomon, well, I'd have to say, you can look at the outline on top of page 18, and you can see what we've had to say about it. But there's nothing here that's going to give you advice on how to live. There's nothing here that you'd have to allegorize just like crazy. I'm still waiting to hear, Pastor, how you allegorize that passage where it says that there were 60 wives and 80 concubines. I want to hear somebody allegorize that. I want to hear that allegorized. What would you do with it? Well, I'm not going to ask too many times, because I'm sure somebody would step up and have a brilliant concept. Now, we're moving right on. We're going to move into the prophets, and we're going to try and tackle Isaiah, which we have a few things to say about Isaiah. And Isaiah is a wonderful, wonderful book. But if we get into it, I want you to notice we're going to move into the prophets. Now, the very designation of Israel and Judah is significant, as many Bible teachers have allegorized the prophecies. But please remember, after Rehoboam, Israel is the 10 tribes that were in the northern part of the land, that they defected and went under Jeroboam, and Jeroboam set up calves to worship at Dan and Bethel, and they led the people astray. And Judah refers to Judah and Benjamin, the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom is the one that lasted till 586. The northern kingdom in 722 BC was taken away by the Assyrians. They swept it away. They took the people out of the land and brought other people in, which was a very interesting thing they did in those days. You conquered a land, you take the people that were there, you take out all of the people, and then you'd bring in people from another conquered land. And so there would just be, I'm not sure the reason to do that, but they did that. It was just a common practice. So the people that were going to be in the northern kingdom, which became the Samaritans, that's why they were Samaritan. That's the problem with them, is that they were Gentile, but there were still some Jews that came back and intermarried with them, so they had these half-breeds. And you'll find when you get into the Gospels, the Jews hated the Samaritans more than they hated the Gentiles, which might sound strange, but they did. They hated them even more. But anyway, Bible teachers have allegorized prophecies. There have always been those men who have misimplied warnings of impending doom for the Old Testament to America. If I could stop right there, I heard a number of guys. I lived near Washington, D.C. when I was in high school, and I was saved when I was in junior high and high school, and that was right in the Virginia area. And so there were guys on the radio out of the D.C. area that were preachers, and there were these men that were preaching all these. They were going to the Old Testament, and they were predicting all these terrible things are going to happen. They're taken right out of the Old Testament. And for a time when I was a young Christian, didn't know any better, it sounded pretty impressive. They're preaching from the Bible. It's the Word of God, isn't it? Well, the problem is that America is not Israel. Did you know we're not a covenant nation with God? Did you know that God is not obligated to do anything for this country? He's not obligated to bless this country. Now, if God chooses to bless it, That's wonderful, and I believe he has. I believe he has, but he's not obligated to. There's no covenant. So when people go back and want to do this, you'll notice I put in here, we reject completely the idea the Old Testament prophets were writing to America or to the church. Just plain and simple. And there's a footnote you can read down there too about it. This study is not going to address either position, as a consistent, literal approach to Scripture will expose the error of allegorizing the Old Testament to misuse it for America or the church. We take it literally. We don't have to talk about error. There's a lot of error that I could have talked about. I could have talked back in the Pentateuch about the Graf-Wellhausen theory, JEPD and all of that. You know why we don't go there? Because those are the words of unsaved men. If we just teach the Bible literally, nobody will even think about that stuff. It'll fade away. We're not going to talk about the fact that there are a bunch of knuckleheads out there, right? And to me they're knuckleheads, who want to divide Isaiah and say there's the first Isaiah and there's chapter 40 is a different man because they're different subjects. You mean if I was writing a book or an article, I couldn't start off and write the first half of the book, and I couldn't change the subject in the second half of the book, and you'd say, Kevin would pick that book up and say, you didn't write that second half, Don. It's a different subject. That's not you. But that's what they do. I mean, we're not going to waste our time on foolishness because this is the Word of God. It says it's from Isaiah. It's from Isaiah. So the errors we're not going to go into. I don't believe in chasing errors. I really don't. I don't do it myself because you know what? It doesn't do me one bit of good to know what these knuckleheads say. I mean, I might just as well go out in the street corner and ask a town drunk what he thinks of the Bible. It'd be about as much help as what these people are saying. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. So, there were prophets, second paragraph, there were prophets active in Israel primarily after the nation was divided into two parts, the 10 northern tribes and the two tribes of the kingdom of Judah and Benjamin. And that began, of course, with Rehoboam back in 1 Kings 12. So, because there were two distinct kingdoms of the nation, there were prophets that ministered uniquely to one kingdom as well as some who ministered to both kingdoms. Because of this, the Old Testament prophecy will uniquely address the needs of the people to whom they ministered. For example, Jeroboam, the king of the first 10 tribes, led the northern kingdom immediately into idolatry. And Jeroboam set up 2 golden calves to prevent the 10 tribes from returning to Jerusalem to worship. Therefore, the message of a prophet to Israel, the northern kingdom, would focus on their departure from the worship of the true God. But now that wasn't going to be as big a problem in the southern kingdom because they did do a lot of idol worship, but officially as a nation, they still worshiped Jehovah God. But the northern kingdom officially did not. And so if a prophet comes along and is ministering to them, it's going to be something different. Now, the first two prophets mentioned in Scripture were Elijah and Elisha, who ministered primarily to the northern 10 tribes. While they wrote no books of their own, Elijah and Elisha began what some have called the golden era of prophets around 875 BC. Now that is right after Rehoboam, some few years after the time of Rehoboam, getting into Ahab. He was one of the first. So I do mention in here, it continued on for about 400 years until Malachi, about 465 BC. And for the breakdown of where and when each prophet ministered, I believe you have the Old Testament prophets timeline and a minor prophets chart in the addendum. So you can check on that if you want to see, because there's a lot that could be said. I don't want to go through every one of them, but it's worth knowing. If you're interested in that, you can see it. Now, one of the problems in understanding Old Testament prophecy is understanding what prophecy is. And here's one I've heard Pastor talk about not long ago. There is a cliche among many Bible teachers that is used to equate pastors with prophets. Prophets, like pastors, were foretellers and forthtellers. Do you know what that is? That's a clever little cliche, a little linguistic cliche that sounds cute. But that's all it is. It just sounds cute. It doesn't hold up. It's not true. Scripture never equates the pastor with an Old Testament prophet and never uses a term like forthteller anywhere. However, in the Old Testament, there were prophets who would predict events that could not be otherwise known. The best example of this you can see is in Isaiah 45, verses 1 through 6, where King Cyrus is mentioned by name over 175 years before he was even born. That is prophecy. Not my saying that the stock market's going to go up, I think, a few points tomorrow, and it goes up a few points. Well, that's not a prophecy. That's just an educated guess, and probably more luck than anything else. So, when we look at prophecy, remember, we are talking about men. Yes, they could address issues and call out people for their unrighteousness. But they were not preachers. They were not evangelists. They were not revivalists. They were still prophets, and they could foretell gloom and doom and disaster, which was not unusual. They would bring judgment. They would expose the error of the people and say what was wrong, and then they say, this is what God's going to do for you. And that was the prophecy. So their statements, what they made, their judgments that they were talking about, the conditions they were referring to, were tied into judgments that were coming in their prophecy. So they were prophets. They weren't preachers. Now, there's one final point before we begin our survey of the prophets. Daniel is not accepted by the Jews as a prophet, even though they do acknowledge that he wrote some important prophecies. But we know that he is, because in Matthew 24:15, bottom of page 18, when we find Jesus says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, let him understand. And so, for that point, Daniel is a prophet. He's not thought of one, and it's interesting that he doesn't really talk of himself as being a prophet, which is, if you notice that, Pastor, that's the one thing that kind of puzzled me, is that he was considered a prophet, but he never talked about himself as being a prophet. And he has some pretty important prophets. The 9th chapter of Daniel, when we get there, that's going to be one of the biggest and most important. That's just a hugely important chapter. So, here we go. We're going to tackle 66 chapters in 20 some odd minutes. Can we do it? Well, if we can do 200 some odd chapters last week, I think 66 in 20 minutes should not be too hard to do. So, Prophet Isaiah. Isaiah is the first of the 4 major prophets. And now that is not because his message was more important than the minor prophets, but it's because of the large amount of truth he recorded. Now, that might sound like a simple thing, but you know what? There are a lot of people that you run across that think minor prophets means they're not very important. That's not true. It's just that Isaiah wrote an awful lot. He was there for a long time, and we know that he ministered from the first chapter. He ministered under the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Now that covers a period of time from about 740 BC to 698, so over some 40-some years. So it's very likely he could have written an awful lot of stuff. Now, some of the other ones, when we get to Jonah, what's interesting about Jonah is Jonah's mentioned once. We don't know how long he was there. We don't know what he did. He was mentioned once before his book that he wrote, before he went to Nineveh, and then we don't see him again until Nineveh. So we don't know how long. And there's others, the men that just came and went, that we don't know. They didn't write anything necessarily. And some of the men that wrote just briefly, Micah was mentioned as being much more important. He has a short book, but as it turns up, he's mentioned as being an important guy when Isaiah was compared to him. So you can't judge the length of the book and indicate that is how important it is. That has nothing to do with it. But Isaiah does have a lot of just remarkable stuff. So you notice that Isaiah was a prophet, as we mentioned here, under those kings. And secondly, the book of Isaiah has two major divisions. And like I said, we're not going to go and try and say and prove that it's the same person. It says it's the book of Isaiah. It's the book of Isaiah. Was it written by 2 men? No, it was written by 1. Is that a good enough answer, folks? It's the Word of God. I'm not going to question anything from what unsaved people think. And by the way, those series like that come along, generally the reason you don't want to consider them is almost every time it's an unsaved person that comes up with an idea. And it's because they just don't believe that this could be prophetic. They want to split it up, and then they want to drag this way into the future, so that instead of being prophetic in sections, it's after the event, looking back, and it's really historical, but the writer wanted to impress you, so he made it sound like he wrote and did prophetic. I'm not going to. That's just a mental sickness of those people. So, beginning with chapter 40, there's a focus. The tone changes with a focus of encouragement and redemption for Israel. Now, there's something interesting I think you want to say, and I want you to look at Isaiah chapter 40 for a moment, because this is going to tie it right into the ministry of Christ, and it's going to do something that you might not have noticed, but I think it's worth knowing. In the 40th chapter, I've been just impressed. And from my point of view, if you want some good theology proper, if you want the best section on theology, go from Isaiah chapter 40 through about Isaiah 50, 51, 52, 54, I believe. You have about 14 or 15 chapters. You have so much about God and the character. You have very important things stated about God all the way through there. And this is a remarkable place. But in the 40th chapter, I want you to see something. It begins at verse 1 by saying, comfort ye, my people, saith your God. So now, this is after a historical section about Hezekiah. We're not going to talk about that, although it'd be fun to talk about Hezekiah and his situation. But so after all of the judgment that you find, it says, comfort ye, my people. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and say to her, her warfare is accomplished, her iniquity is pardoned, for she hath received of the Lord's hand double for her sins. Now stop. Now look what follows. This is a prediction of somebody that turns out to be none other than John the Baptist. So the comfort of the people was designated to begin with John the Baptist, was to begin the comfort, because that was going to be the promise of the kingdom. Had they listened to John, had they believed, had they taken Christ as king and not rejected him, they would have gotten all the benefits that are going to be described later in these chapters that follow. And you'll notice it goes on to say, it is him, the voice of him that cries in the wilderness. Now that's John identified himself as being the voice of one crying in the wilderness. So this was John. He is this person. And let's read on. There's something that you're going to see down here that I think is rather interesting. It shows you something about what his character may have been. The voice of him that cries in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. Stop there for a moment. What does that mean? You know what that means? If we're going to be literal, the millennial kingdom, there's going to be topographical changes to the old planet Earth. You realize that on the planet Earth, I read this some time back, that on the surface of the Earth, 25% of the surface of the Earth is land. Of that 25%, about 20% of that, the 25% is actually farmable, can actually produce anything. And that includes like cattle, raising cattle, sheep and everything. The Himalayas, you look at that big section of the Himalayas, that can't be used for anything. You've got huge desert across North Africa, Sahara Desert. Doesn't do much for farmers, does it? So in the millennial kingdom, this is all going to be straightened out. And so when you see that, this is to be taken literally. So there's going to be comfort. There's going to be land all over the place. There's going to be more land than you know what to do with. We think there's land now when you go some places in the Midwest of this country. Wait till we get there. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. So this was what he was going to do. The glory of the Lord shall be revealed. This was the man who was going to introduce it. But now look at verse 6. I think verses 6 through 8, you just might see something that John the Baptist said initially when he was given this ministry. The voice said, cry. And he said, what shall I cry? Now, who is the he said, what shall I cry? It's the voice of the one crying in the wilderness. And here's his initial response. What shall I cry? All flesh is grass, and the goodliness thereof is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, and because the Spirit of the Lord blows on it, it blows upon it. Surely this people is grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God shall stand forever. I believe that you're looking at right there. That's the thoughts of John the Baptist as he starts out. You know, he says, what am I going to say? These grass, temporary. These people are not going to last. They're not going to do anything. There's a little bit of cynicism there. So if you've ever wondered what John the Baptist thought, he was not duped when he began his ministry. He did not think that everybody was going to flock to him. Because if you read some of the things that are said about him, he looked at some of the people and he said, oh, you race of snakes. Generation of vipers? Let's make it modern English. Generation, this is a better word. That's our word again. It means race or stock or kind. You race of snakes? Oh, you family of snakes? Oh, yeah, well, you look at that and tell me if that doesn't sound like something that you read back here, 6, 7, and 8. So to me, it's somewhat fascinating that you would see a prediction and a little bit of what this man might have been like. So here's the man that was, and it shows you what God's plan was in his prophecy. The restoration of Israel, it was supposed to have begun with John the Baptist and the announcement of Christ. Now, they wouldn't have known it. We wouldn't have known it without the Gospels, but it did happen there. Now, oh boy, among the many, you'll notice another paragraph down here. Among the unique things, this is the 1, 2, under the prophet Isaiah, this is the third paragraph down. Among the unique things that Isaiah reveals are some of the most detailed prophecies concerning Messiah. And I give you some references there. In the 53rd chapter. Oh my goodness. If you want some interesting reading and you want to spend some time, go on the internet and type in Rabbis on Isaiah 53. See what the Jews do. They have a fit. One of them I was reading through some of it just for my own entertainment here, and one of them said, one of the rabbis admitted that they do not at any time read Isaiah 53 ever in any synagogue service. They never include that in there. Why? Because they know what it's, but you know what's funny is they say, well, why should we be worried that Christians interpret it this way? We're avoiding it because Christians interpret it that way. You know what I think? They know what it says and they don't want to admit it, so they're making a scapegoat. Well, the Christians say that's what it means, so we're not going to read it because of that. But then the same rabbi turned around and said, well, why are we letting him affect us? So I wasn't really sure if that rabbi was saying he wanted to read it. But you know, one of the things they do to get around Isaiah 53, one of their great scholars, a man named Rashi, said that, well, the suffering servant was the people of Israel. The whole nation of Israel suffered. And someone else later wrote, after everybody joined on the wagon, somebody finally said, hey, it says he, singular. That's not a whole nation. A he. He's going to do this. He shall suffer. He's going to grow up like a tender plant. He's not a whole nation. So they've gone through hoops of fire, and they're faced with something. I've even heard, now I don't know, I've never been able to substantiate this, but they say in some synagogues, there's a piece of black velvet laid over that chapter. If you open the Old Testament, there's a piece of black velvet over the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. But the one rabbi did say that none of the synagogue services read at any time ever Isaiah 53. I wonder why. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? So, now, one thing I want to suggest to you, there's an important thing in here. To me, this is extremely important because it ties in with Ezekiel 28. You can see right into the heart and mind of Satan from Isaiah. This is unique because in Job, you can see the only time recorded where Satan speaks face-to-face to God on the throne. Now, he spoke to Jesus. Some, there's a limitation. But you look at Job 1 and 2, you have Satan talking to God face-to-face, and you see him seething with contempt. Now, you want to know what he was thinking before he left? Do you know that actually Isaiah, I want you to turn to the 14th chapter. This is to me, is one of the most thrilling parts of Isaiah. There's so much good here. But I have used this with guys to show them the importance of learning Hebrew. Because if you just read the English, you see something important, yes, but you miss something even more important. You miss a detail. You see, he says, I will. You'll notice the famous I wills in Isaiah 14, beginning in verse 13 and down through verse 14. He's going to say, I will 5 times in your King James Version. Guess how many times he actually said, I will? Not once. He never said, I will. Didn't say that. Grammatically speaking, the Hebrew language is nice and simple. It has either complete action in a verb or incomplete action. If it's incomplete action, it looks at something it's either starting or is going to happen in the future. This is incompleted action. He's not saying, I will, because it makes it sound like it's completed action. No. What he literally says, he says this. I am going. Not I will, but he says in looking at verse 13, for you've said in your heart, I'm going to ascend into heaven. Now he's not saying tomorrow, next week. I'm going. And to me, that sounds like right now. It's incompleted action. I'm going. I don't think he's talking about the future, because there'd be no reason to talk. He's got his plans all made up. He's already had a rebellion. He's already got a whole lot of angels behind him. And so now he thinks he can pull this off, and it gets better. But he says, so I would literally say, and I've looked at this in the Hebrew, and believe me, it should be translated this way. I guarantee it. In verse 13 he says, for you have said in your heart. Now this is what he's saying to himself, and I believe just as he's ready to go, just at the moment he's ready to take off and go and start his rebellion, this is what he says in his heart. Now I don't know about you, but sometimes if I'm doing something, in my mind I'll say it, and I might even say it out loud. Well, now I'm going to go do this. Well, if you're singing in your mind, you're thinking to yourself, I'm going to go do this. Now's the time. I'm going to go. And what he says here, I believe, is, I'm going to ascend into heaven. Okay? He says, I'm going. Now, he was on earth. Even Ezekiel, you have to tie this passage back to Ezekiel 28, verses 11 through 19. If you put those two sections of Scripture together, you know all that there is to be revealed about Satan, but you know quite a bit, because it tells you what he did, and this tells you why he did it. Why did he rebel against God? This is what was in him. And really, when you look at these 5 things that he says, I think you can boil them down to one simple statement. I deserve better. When I look at Satan and his dealings and how he likes to deal with us, he tries to hook us into believing, oh, you poor little, you deserve better than that. So I get disappointed, I get depressed, I have to go see my therapist and get some more. That's what Satan does, because he can hook you with, you put the thought in, I deserve better. Poor me, I've been cheated. Well, he did that with Eve. If you look back, you deserve better. You have to ask God to know the difference between good and evil. You could know it yourself. You deserve better. That's what got her. She deserved better because, by the way, you know, back there with Eve, there's something I'll bet you didn't realize. It says God walked in the garden every day. He didn't walk with Eve. You know why I'd say that? Because if you look at any dispensation, the steward gets the revelation. The steward. Who was the steward of the dispensation of innocence? Adam. Who walked with God and got the information? Adam. Who got it secondhand? Who was ripe for, you deserve better? There's your answer right there. That's what you've got to see to understand what's going on back there. So, anyway, so we have Satan in his heart. He says, I am ascending right now. I'm going right above it. Then he says, I will exalt. Now it says I will exalt. It's different than that. It's a causative. He said, I am going to cause my throne to be lifted above the stars. I am myself, I'm going to make it happen. There's a unique form of the Hebrew that puts a real strong emphasis on the fact that you made it happen. And so he is saying here, I am going to make this happen. I am going to lift my throne above. This is emphatic on his part. If he was pounding the pulpit in his head, which you're thinking in your heart, he wouldn't be pounding anything. But if you're saying it, I myself am going to do it. That's what it means. He was going to make it happen. So he was determined. There's no question. His throne was on earth. This is where God put him. If you look at Ezekiel 28, it says he was on earth. He walked in the stones of fire. He was important in the government of God. He had a throne there. He said, no, I deserve better. It's going up with me. I'm going to take it up and I'm going to exalt this, raise it above. The word for exalt really means to lift it above. I'm going to place it above the stars of God. Well, now he's going where he shouldn't be going. He's going to continue. I will set on the mount of congregation in the side of the north. I'm going to set there. I'm going right now. I'm going to set on the mount of congregation. Who sets on the mount of congregation, by the way? Does anybody know? God sits there. Nobody but God. There's a throne there that has probably 3 seats. The Father sits in one seat, the Son sits in the right hand, and probably the Holy Spirit sits in the left hand, I'm guessing. And so there's a throne there, and only deity is there. Now, he's going to take his throne and set it right next to God. Now, this is what he says. I am going. He's not saying I want to do this. He says, I am going. He is right then and there. As I look at it, I can just almost picture in my mind that he's picked up his throne. He's got his throne and says, I'm going. I'm taking my throne. I'm going to take it up there. He's got his throne in hand. He's ready to go. This is no joke. He is dead serious about this. Then he says, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I'm going to ascend above the heights of the clouds. Now, what clouds is he talking about? If he's gone above the stars of God, he's already gone above the clouds. What clouds is he talking about? What they call the clouds of glory? The Jews have a name for it, the Shekinah, the clouds of God's glory. He will lift his throne up above the clouds of God, up above the glory of God. Hey, no, wait a minute. He's putting himself above God. He's independent of God. If you've heard it said that he wanted to be independent, this is it. He was going to lift his throne up and set it above the glory clouds of God on the mount. So if the mount of congregation came up and God's throne was here, he was going to put his throne higher up on the mountain, overlooking it all, like he was the overseer. Is that brash? Is that crazy? Yeah, it sure enough is. But it shows you something's happened to him to do this. He knew he was supposed to be on earth. He had the best position of any spirit being. He had the highest position. But that wasn't good enough. Because here comes the barn burner. He says, I will be like the Most High, verse 14. That's not what it says. That's not what it says. I am going to make myself like the Most High. It's a middle voice. Very emphatic in the Hebrew. I am going to make myself like the Most High. He thought he could make himself like God. Now, he wasn't making himself God. He was making himself like God. What does that mean? He was going to take his throne up there, set it above God's throne, and he was not going to answer to God for anything. He was going to roll his little fiefdom with a whole bunch of angels, and he wasn't going to answer to God for what he was doing. That's what was going on. Now you see what was going on. This was serious. 1/3 of the angels, from his point of view, Satan, he's all bloated up with pride, and he really thinks he can do this, because he says, I am going to do this. This is incompleted action. It means I'm going now to do it. I'm going to make myself like the Most High. Now, he's not saying he's going to be God. No. People try to say he's trying to set himself up, and he's going to be up there with his throne sitting above God, which means he's beyond God's control. He's on his own. He's his own man. He's going to rule it with his own little angels. I don't know what he had in mind, but that's what he was going to do. Now, if you see that, now you understand something about Satan, because this is, you're looking in his heart. And you know how crazy this being is? Do you know today, he can read the Bible, do you know today he doesn't believe he's defeated? Well, ask yourself, would he be fighting to make his demise in the lake of fire? Would he be fighting to make his punishment worse if he knew he's defeated? I mean, come on. Is he stupid? No. If he's fighting today, it must be because he thinks he's got a chance. If you look at how he talked to God in Job 1 and 2, he actually thought that he was going to manipulate the circumstances and outdo God in Job 1 and 2. He wouldn't have tempted Job and done what he did if he thought he wasn't going to succeed, would he? Now, how bad is this guy? There's some indication. There's a case in the Gospels, and I don't remember the reference, but you can look it up, where some of the demons said when they were cast out, don't send us into the abyss now. They know and understand they're going to the abyss. In other words, they understand they're defeated. But who doesn't think he's defeated? Well, Scott did the New Testament. Scott, forgive me, but let's go to Revelation 12. I know I'm getting into your territory. But I want you to see Revelation 12, and if you just make the one slight change in the understanding of what it says, the implication of what it says in Revelation 12. This is the arrogance of Satan. You think this being is proud and arrogant? No, he's powerful, and he's not somebody that anybody should ever toy with. Nobody should ever mess with this boy. This being is so far above anything. You don't want to mess with this man, or not man, this being. Now, if you look and you find, beginning back at verse 9, let's start verse 7. Revelation 12, verse 7. And this is going to tie into how bad Satan, how much arrogance he has. There was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought with his angels. And prevailed not, neither was there found any more in heaven, or place found any more in heaven. And that great dragon was cast out, that old serpent. That's how you know he was a serpent. That old serpent, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So they're thrown out of heaven. So this is mid-trib. So now all of a sudden, Satan doesn't have access to heaven anymore. Well, he's been going there for a long time, and he's been accusing the brother, and he's been accusing us for any time we sin. I always think good thing to remind yourself of. If you're getting ready to sin and you're tempted to do something, ask yourself, do you want to give Satan the get-out-of-jail-free card? In other words, do you want to give Satan one free accuse God card? Because when I sin, I'm giving Satan the card that he can go up and say, look what he did. Weren't you going to do something? It's like I'm embarrassing God. Do I really want to do that? That's just a thought, you know. He still goes up there today. But now, let's skip down to verse 12. Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and you that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and sea, for the devil has come down unto you, having great wrath. Now he was subtle up to this point, because he knows he has but a short time. Now that word for know is a word that means you know intellectually. It's the first step in knowledge. First you have intellectual knowledge, which is an awareness of facts. Then perhaps you learn you understand what they mean. For example, I understand E equals mc squared. Does anybody else understand that? Do they know what that is? Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Now what do you do with it? Well, you write it on the board to impress people. What does it mean? I don't. But I'm acquainted with the facts, but I don't know what to do with it. Now, what this tells you is Satan is now acquainted with the facts. Let's paraphrase this so you can see it. Let's put a paraphrase. It's just dawned on Satan that he has a short time. Paraphrase it that way, because that's really what it means. He gets cast out of heaven, and now he says, oh boy, all of this stuff I've been reading, it was right. I'm almost finished. But it says he's just dawned. You realize up to this point, he can read all this, and he doesn't believe it. He looks at the prophecy of the Bible as being the potential. It's what God wants to do, but Satan says, I can outsmart him. Oh, really? You did a good job with Job. You did a good job in the garden because all you did is guarantee your condemnation, your damnation. And let's see, you did a good job at killing Christ at his birth. That didn't work either. You did a good job polluting the whole human bloodline back in Genesis 6. Well, that didn't work either. What has he done that has worked? It's really something. This is one determined rascal. It's nothing has ever, and it still hasn't dawned on him he's defeated. Not until he's thrown out of heaven. Now, if you want to know how arrogant he is, you put those things together, and that's a stunning picture of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Now, there's more we could say about the book of Isaiah, and I'm going to, because of the sake of time, there's just one last thing. I mean, there's just so much here I'd love to talk about. But I want you to look at Isaiah 65 because there's something here that is not found anywhere else in the Bible, and it causes some people all kinds of problems. I want to just take a quick look at it, and I want to give you my 2 cents worth on it, and then we'll take time for questions because we're getting right close to the hour. But in Isaiah 65:17, there's something said here that just really, I was even asked formally a question in Sunday school, and I always threw open for questions. I never got questions for the most part, but I did on this one subject one time. Isaiah 65, verse 17. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and now we know new heavens and new earth, that's Revelation 20, but notice what it says, and the former shall not be remembered nor come to mind. This is the first time in the Bible this is ever said. You don't know anything about new heaven. This is it. This is the first time it's ever revealed. But what really gives people the fits? The former shall not be remembered nor come into mind. You know what people are going to ask you? Pastor, I know you know what they're going to ask you. You mean in eternity, I won't remember Jesus Christ and the work on the cross? I'll forget about that? Yeah, that's what it means. Well, ask yourself a simple question. Eternity future. There's a new heavens. 2 Peter says a new heaven and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. Righteousness settles down and feels at home, and that is all that will be here. Now here in the future, Scott and I run into each other, and I say, hey Scott, do you remember the time I sinned back there and made a complete fool out of myself? And then Scott says, do you know the time? Oh, that sounds like the time I did. Are we going to want to look, would you want to look back and remember the stupid things you did, the sins you committed? How many people here want to remember their past like that? Is it a terrible thing to forget it? You see, what I do is I think the way we should look at this creation, up to the new heavens and new earth, is this is kind of like if you've ever gone to a Shakespeare play. When anyone, like the Taming of the Shrew, they bring out all the props and put them on stage. Those props are only for the Taming of the Shrew. If some other play comes on by Caesar or someone else, are they going to use the same props again? No, they're going to take them down, move them out of the way, put up new props. What am I saying? This universe is the props, the stage setting for the drama that's playing out right now. When that drama is finished, the props are all going to be taken down. And in fact, Revelation tells us they're going to be all burned up. They're not going to be here. Now, you mean we're going to forget about the work of Christ? The last thing we'll probably remember as we go out of this into the eternal future is we're going to know that God made it possible, that God did what was necessary for us to get there. And that's all we're going to need to know. That's really all we will have to remember. Because if we get into eternity future, we have to remember, well, Christ died for my sins. What are those? He did these things. How much happiness is there going to be? I don't want to look back at the list of dirty laundry I've got. I don't want to do that, and I'm sure you don't either. So that's my take on it, but you do see here, this is unique because this is the first time I've seen it in the Old Testament, and I think it may be the only time in the Old Testament. I don't recall. If you see anything, let me know, but I don't remember it being anywhere else anything like this. This is like Revelation, but the one difference is with even Revelation doesn't say that the past will be completely forgotten. But you know what? I'm looking forward to that. I do not want to remember all the things that have gone on down here. I don't want to remember the stuff that's going on in politics. I don't remember all the garbage that's done and all the stuff I've been sucked into in the past in politics and the time I've wasted and the thing. No, I don't remember none of those things. I think you probably all feel the same way. At least I hope you do. So this is Isaiah. There's so much in here. In this last section, there's so many things said about, if you want, like I said, a good treatise on theology is the 40th to about the 54th chapter, and then about the 55th chapter through the end of the book, you'll find a lot of things that detail about what the glory of the future kingdom that Israel is going to have will be like. So there's just so much here. And if you don't read the book of Isaiah, you're missing a treasure. You're missing a real treasure. There's a lot of things about judgment. In the first part, specific judgments, and you can see them in our outline. And then, of course, you have the latter part, and the outline on to page 20 is really, you see the things that are going to happen. Israel is going to be restored. The Messiah is going to do a remarkable work. Israel is going to be expanded in their borders. And point number 38, despite God's promises, Israel still persists in sin. So there was still a little bit of warning in there too. So the book of Isaiah, you got to read it, folks. It's well worth your time. Questions? Questions? We covered a lot in Isaiah.
Kind of like a carnival ride of chapter 66.
What's that now?
Chapter 66 of Isaiah, verse 24.
There,
Is this what we'll see?
I think what you have here is one of the clever things that prophecy does to keep unbelievers from understanding some things and to keep us dependent on the Holy Spirit for illumination. When you look at that, you have a flashback. You see that also in the book of Revelation when it talks about new heavens, new earth, and all of a sudden it goes backwards into the millennial kingdom. So what you're doing here is this is going back. This is what's going to happen. This will be what would happen during the millennial kingdom if people were to sin. So this is commonly done in prophecy. It's not put in sequential order because if it was, you could have unbelievers getting a hold of this. But this now is confusing for believers. Unbelievers have no way of understanding this. So I believe it's done this way to keep us dependent on God. We look to Him for understanding. And we realize that, well, if what we know in the New Testament is true, then this is not going to be possible in eternal state. This is not going to be possible. But it would be possible if you remember, and Pastor has covered that in some of his messages about what's going to happen in the millennial kingdom, that there are going to be people that sin and they're going to be taken right out and they're going to be taken to the lake of fire. So there is going to be some pretty harsh stuff in it, and this can go right back into that time. So that's what it is. It's just kind of you flip things around, and like I said, it will keep us. We need to depend upon the Holy Spirit to be interpreting it and to look at it. And then when you see how it fits together, it's not contradictory at all. Yes, questions, more questions. Well, okay. Then why don't we just close in a word of prayer and